Welcome back to Wait, What Do You Do Again? I'm your host, Meghan DeFord. Today's guest is Jeremy Swick, and he is one of those people where I look at the bio and immediately think, okay, wait, how did all of these things happen in one life? Jeremy is a podcast host, a producer, historian, curator, archivist, entrepreneur, rugby player, and storyteller. He spent more than a decade in the museum and archival world, including work with the College Football Hall of Fame and Pro Football Hall of Fame, and today runs Swick Media while hosting the podcast Into the Unknown, which I was a guest on. Thank you so much. It was really fun. Beyond the titles, Jeremy has a really fascinating personal story. He was born in Guatemala City, raised in Wisconsin, and so much of his life and work are connected to identity and curiosity, storytelling, and the courage to pursue things that genuinely interest him. So today we're talking about history and museums, rugby, taking risks, and what happens when you stop trying to fit into one neat little box. Jeremy, welcome to the show. And my first question for you is, when someone asks you what you do, how do you answer?
First of all, Meghan, I want to say thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm really excited to get into this conversation.
Yeah, it's great. And actually, my first question, I'm going to back up. My actual first question for people who are watching, you got to tell us what's behind you. What's going on? This is like a very impressive collection behind you.
It's funny, going back, and we'll get into my history background a little bit. The way museums started, they were often called cabinets of curiosity, where a lot of times it was odds and ends and trinkets. I mean, I have to laugh because some of them had like mermaids, which were like monkeys sewn onto fish. It was some outlandish things that back in the day. But I have to joke because I feel like I have a little bit of my own cabinet of curiosity as well. Primarily right behind me, you can see is a ton of bobbleheads.
Yeah.
I am a proud member of the Bobblehead Hall of Fame, which is located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And as long as I can remember, I've been collecting. You know, when it's nice behind a case, it's collecting. It's not hoarding. When they look nice, it's not hoarding.
I love that. That is awesome. Do you have a favorite bobblehead?
I would have to say I actually do. Well, let's see if we can.
Don't tell the others, but you can show us.
I don't definitely a long comment. And is right here. And his name is Cecil Cooper.
And he played for the 1982 Brewers, which was a bit before my time. But it was one of those things growing up as a kid. My brother's 20 years older than me. And so I grew up a diehard Brewers baseball fan. And so I learned all these names of guys who played long before I lived. One of the most amazing things about him, and it'll be a little difficult to see, signed the top of it. And as a kid, I got to meet him. And of course, just share a little bit about my journey of how much I enjoy baseball. But that's why he sits right up there. But that's probably one of my favorites.
That's really cool. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And okay, so I'll get back. We're at the cocktail party and I'm like, Jeremy, what do you do? How do you even answer that question? Because you have so much going on.
I really appreciate that question because it gets difficult. And I always kind of joke, it depends on the timing. If we're really trying to get to know each other, I'll usually start with, I'm a storyteller. And that kind of gets people looking at you like, what does that mean? And, you know, sometimes I love diving deeper into that. And a lot of times now it's a little bit more towards talking about the podcasting and business space. But often, if I'm by any of my friends, someone will jump in and ask them about the Hall of Fame or ask them about this. And so I do like sticking with the idea of being a storyteller because I think a lot of my journey has that story that unfolded, not just in my personal life, but from a historical lens as well, which also eventually created the business. And a large part of the business was creating stories for smaller brands and even museums to share their digital story, because I realized I saw a gap, not only in my resume, trying to get museum jobs, but also seeing museums that would outsource their social to a content machine, which is a good job. It got you graphics, whatever you needed, but it wasn't able to really pull out those layers of really feeling like the night at the museum, if you will. And so a lot of that storytelling aspect came from that identity of a historian and archivist, but then also now as a business owner.
And remind me to ask you this question later, like the difference between storytelling and marketing. But before we get in that, so you were born in Guatemala City and adopted into the US. And how has that shaped your identity over the years?
That has shaped my identity in the most incredible ways. And of course, it's not all sunshine and rainbows, but I always like to back up that story even a little bit.
Yeah.
Again, being a storyteller.
Yeah.
In 1954, the U.S. and CIA and United Fruit Company, which later became Chiquita,
Mhm.
overthrew a democratically elected leader in 1954 in Guatemala. About 6 years later, that created a power vacuum and led to a 36-year civil war. I was born in year 31 of that 36-year civil war. It was actually too dangerous for my parents. And for the rest of the podcast, when I mention my parents, it's the ones who adopted me to the States. I call them my parents. For all intents and purposes, they are my parents. But I always like to make that distinction as well. It was actually too dangerous for even them to come down to adopt me.
Mhm.
So they had to meet elsewhere to have that kind of go through. But one of the things about that, it was a largely the orphanage I was at, there was a large amount of children there. There were three of us to a crib and multiple cribs to rooms at times. And the way luck, fate, however you have it, all three of us were actually from Wisconsin. We ended up being adopted from Wisconsin. And one of the ones I've lost contact with, Ben, but Teresa, I call her like my bonus sister, if you will. We've known each other. We joke longer than we've known our parents because we were adopted around the same time. But going off that, one of the tragedies about just how chaotic that place is, I was actually dropped in my head and it cracked my skull in several places, leading to a subdued hematoma, which was swelling in my brain. Of course, they call my parents up here and they are speaking nothing but Spanish. My parents don't speak Spanish. Luckily, one of my uncles was from Mexico and was able to kind of translate and basically explain that something had happened. And basically, what it came down to is, would you like another one? Basically, would you like a different kid? Because this one, some lack of better words,
Right.
kind of damaged. Okay, we get it. And of course, my parents were, well, absolutely not. That's our kid now. And so I think without being told that as a young age, I knew that I felt special in the sense that I was chosen not once, but like twice. Unfortunately, that led to, they think I may have had shaken baby syndrome just from them being overworked at the orphanage, just trying to get me to stop crying because my skull cracked and all that. And thankfully, long term, there was not a ton of health risks. I have a VP shunt, which drained blood from my brain out to stop the swelling. And my whole family jokes that my neurosurgeon, if he was still around, would be turning in his grave knowing I've played rugby the last 17 years. But thankfully, there's been no health complications with that. But
Yeah.
that really was kind of a foundational moment for me because my parents, you look at a family photo, they're white as snow. I always give them a hard time about that. And so it's very clear that there's a little bit of a difference. And so they always did an incredible job of talking to me about being adopted and kind of where I was from and all that, and to the best of their abilities as well. It was the 90s. There's only so much book and research out there really at the time. But
Right.
one of the amazing things, and of course it'll tie into our story a little bit later, at the Milwaukee Public Museum on the third floor, and they're now remodeling it, it's going away, unfortunately, there was a Guatemalan marketplace. And of course, it was from the 80s, 90s, so a bit dated, probably from a historical lens, maybe a little inaccurate. But for me as a kid, it was a cool place to tell my friends about, or we go on a field trip. I think I knew every inch of that diorama, that area, because it felt like it was something of me that I didn't quite have a grasp on. And it was just one of those incredible experiences because I think from a young age, it really incited that curiosity to want to learn and to know more. And one of the great things my folks did was we had those summer reading programs. And, you go to the library, you get X amount of books, you read a certain amount of minutes, and you get a prize. And back then it was the Milwaukee Bucks tickets because we didn't have Giannis yet. We weren't very good. And, it was pretty easy to get tickets. But their one rule was the fact that I had to actually read whatever, but I could read whatever I wanted as long as it wasn't like a picture book or a comic.
Sure.
And so I heavily gravitated towards biographies, autobiographies, anything I could do with sports. And then things I found interesting in history. I remember watching the History Channel as a kid, and this was a bit before Ancient Aliens and things like that.
It
Which
was
were
actually history. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. And it gravitated my curiosity so much that I think I knew way too much about the pyramids of Giza at like a third grader because I just found it, saw it, and I would just devour the books. And of course, it was cool to get the rewards or the tickets or whatever it may be, but I think it really fostered my early interest in history.
That's awesome. That's amazing. And I love how you start your origin story with a 30 plus year civil war in 1954. And you can tell you're such a storyteller. But it gives so much more context and color to what you're saying. Have you been back to Guatemala?
I have not yet been back. It's kind of my list to do. It's funny because my sister was also adopted from Guatemala, same country, different family, and that time we didn't go down there either. But I remember, and I always joke with her that the way I found out I was getting a sister, and it's a little different for those that have an adoption because it's not like you see your mom with the child. We got down to, I think, Miami, and they took me to Disney World before to ease the conversation because that's another thing to have another human being at like 13 months there. She was 13 months and just, oh, hey, this is your sister now. And so I have to laugh because they took me to Disney World before I got my sister, but it was amazing, but I have not been back. It's definitely on my list to do. And one of the things that I say about starting that story so early, in 1954, is of course, that's not how I always understood the story.
Right.
But I have so many questions that I don't think obviously my parents didn't have the answers for, but I didn't quite have the answers. So it started me doing more and more research. Okay, so why were so many of us adopted?
Yeah.
Okay, because that seems, okay, adoption's relatively normal. I get that. But why are there so many leaving this country? And a lot of us went everywhere between the US, Canada, Egypt, the United Kingdom, and Israel. That's where a large amount of the diaspora went. And so it was a lot of years of me trying to learn a little more and just kind of wrap my head around why there were so many and during that time period.
Yeah. And is there a strong Guatemalan community in Milwaukee or like now or not really?
So it is interesting, and I appreciate you asked that. Growing up, my folks took me to a lot of Guatemalan play groups and things like that. And it was great. I mean, I'll be honest, a little cheesy, but I understood that they were trying to teach us about our culture a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think the other side of that, and we'll get into the identity part, I felt pretty Midwestern in the sense of how I understood and how I looked at the world. Outside of my complexion, I didn't speak Spanish. I still don't speak Spanish. And so I felt for a long time there was a bit of a disconnect in the sense as I got older, while I understood the history, I couldn't speak Spanish. And I have to laugh because I still have people come up to me and speak Spanish to me, and I can mutter out como se dice gringo. But it's interesting because I think I kind of put that aspect of my heritage kind of away until I started getting farther into college and really ended up, and we'll get into that about the history aspect. But I think for a long time, it really wasn't a major factor. And even now, I think my life has just developed in such a way that I do have to laugh because I can kind of tell when someone's Guatemalan and they can tell when I am. And sometimes that conversation comes up and it's funny because it'll be like in a bar or like randomly and,
Like lock eyes.
And you're just like, there's something about you I know and you know, but we can't quite confirm it. But that's kind of one of those aspects in that sense.
You use the name average historian, which is really kind of funny because I don't think there's anything average about you. But like, where did that come from?
I appreciate you asking that. It was so funny because I think I started that probably midway through grad school. So I got my undergrad in history education, pivoted pretty quickly to grad school to earn my master's in public history. During that time period, I had started kind of an Instagram page talking about history a little bit. My only regret is I deleted a lot of my teaching content and stuff early on. In hindsight, I should have just archived it and like put it out, but you don't know at the time. And so it really started becoming more and more history content. And I think the realization, especially in grad school and out of grad school, is when I was in grad school, I had so many incredible, educated people around me to the point where I felt a little bit of that imposter syndrome. Like I was thinking of my friend Leah, very, very smart. Some of the most intelligent people I've ever met. And I felt like I almost backdoored my way in, and we'll get into how I got into grad school, but I almost backdoored my way in, and I felt like I almost, not that I didn't belong, but like I was somehow not quite to the same level as they were. And I realized pretty quickly, okay, no, I do belong. I've earned my spot here. It just looked a little different than theirs. But one of the things is I always got jokes that I gave people, especially as a historian, I gave people your famous social studies teacher vibe. Instead of like the historian in their ivory tower who doesn't like to talk around people and likes to be by their books. Instead, I'm a little bit more of the gym teacher, social studies teacher kind of vibe. And so the joke with the average historian kind of started that I'm just kind of the average guy. I'm a regular guy.
Yeah.
I just happen to have had and earned some incredible experiences.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, you're like the Bill Nye of history, right? Like making it accessible. So, how did you decide, like, what drew you to history in the first place? And then you've got to tell the school story.
So it's funny you mention that because as we talked about growing up, I'd always been
Yeah.
interested in history, but I'd never really given it much of a thought. I remember it was the 90s, early 2000s, and we were that road trip family. So we road tripped everywhere from South Dakota down to the Carolinas and back, and a lot of experience, and got to see a lot of really interesting parts of the country that hindsight I never would have, and now I will never because I like to fly places now. That Midwest is not quite in me. Driving 6 is about my limit, but we make it work. But I always love going to those monuments, learning more about history. I wasn't incredibly confident as a student going into college. I had at one point in high school I had a 2.1 GPA, which is, you're almost trying to fail at that point, to be frank. It's hard to get that low of scores. But one of the things I did is I would ace gym classes and I would get like B's in history. And people were like, oh, why'd you just get B's? I'm like, because I wouldn't do the homework. Did I read the whole book? Yes. Did I do the worksheet? No, I didn't do the work. I can tell you about it. I can talk about it because I read probably more than the chapter you assigned because I found it interesting. And a little bit of that obviously is that maturity growing up and like, you have to do stuff you don't want to do. That being said, you don't always have to do stuff that you don't want to do. And I kind of, maybe I realized that a little early, or I realized that there were different ways to avoid that. But I always really enjoyed those history classes. I learned a ton. And even then, I don't think I thought about any field in history.
Mhm.
We fast forward, I'm starting to do my college planning. And I remember the guidance counselor, of course, doing the best they could with their knowledge, handed me tech school and military papers because based on my trajectory of success at the higher level, I probably won't do well, last a semester and be gone. Respectfully, on paper, that's exactly how it looked. That being said, it really upset me internally. And I was like, okay, well, let me show you guys. Within like a semester, I turned my grades around. I think I finished my senior year with a 3.9 both semesters because I knew I just had to turn it on.
You just had to try.
Just try a little bit. But it's funny because I got accepted to the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, and I only applied for a few places, but I had to start on academic probation, which is usually what you get at the end of school, not to. I realized pretty quickly that through some of my great friends that helped me on that journey because they actually went to where I went to high school, and then we kind of ended up going to college together as well. And it was one of those things where I had to learn how to be a student as a freshman because I had never done homework and never done almost anything other than the things I liked.
Yeah.
And I think I realized I thought they were like cheating, but it was really more like methods of studying. Like you don't have to read the whole book. You can read the table of contents and the first couple sections so you can kind of get a grasp. You don't have to read it from front to back. And just other kind of things to study on, flashcards, which these are very common student things. But I just never did them, so I never really had practice. And I was fortunate, again, not really knowing a whole lot about school, about college. They have you have your welcome week, and you can sign up for this. They called it the bundle. And you sign up for a bundle classes, which meant I didn't have to think about much more than maybe one general education course. Well, I took that, and it was about a class of about 14 of us. And I walk in there, and of the 14, it's one of my really good friends from middle school who had moved to Minnesota. And of course, we have phones. It's not quite in smartphone era yet because it's 2010-ish. And get in there, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I haven't seen you in a while. I knew he was going to Eau Claire, but it was still the fact that now we're going to hang out all the time. And we ended up becoming roommates at one point, I think in like year 5 or something like that. But it was one of those really cool experiences because one of the classes was some history classes, and I instantly found them fascinating. I still have one of my favorite books. It's called The World History in like 6 Glasses. And it talks about everything from the beer in Mesopotamia, which is really one of the first forms of payment. People are getting, paid in beer in Mesopotamia, all the way through the things like the pirates and the rum trade, the spices, and it ends with globalization and Coca-Cola. And it was a really fascinating book. I remember I devoured it multiple times. And still then, I didn't really see the connection other than I really enjoyed that class.
Yeah.
And my professor, Dr. Rice, she was absolutely incredible. she ended up becoming my advisor and like one of my confidants and one of kind of, I'll just say one of my people as you kind of advance in school. But it was funny because I still, I did well, didn't had pretty much close to straight A's. I think I ended up finishing my undergrad with like a 3.7, 3.8. But I did really well, which was encouraging for me on the level that I didn't think I was a great student. But I really love these history classes. And I remember we took an exam. It was one of those bigger lecture hall classes, and a lot of those exams are curved. And so whoever does the best, that's the grade. Well, she's talking. I realized pretty quickly if I just sit in the front, I retain more too, so I'm not distracted. So I just started doing that too on accident, I guess you could say. But I remember her talking, and it was a somewhat difficult exam, a little bit of multiple choice, all that. But I enjoyed whatever subject it was. She's talking. She said, well, we grade it on a curve, but actually someone got all 103 or what questions right. And in my brain, like, this is a Friday morning, and I'm in college, so Thursday, I probably had a good time the night before. I'm like, oh, what kind of nerd studied for all this hard? I read the book, but I didn't really do much studying after that because thankfully the way I saw history is a story. So this guy could not have done this if this didn't happen first. And so just logically, as I was answering the question, well, it didn't even take me that long because I just kind of knew the story. Well, it might surprise you. I was the one who got the 100% on the exam. And I had to laugh because I had no idea. I knew I did well, but I didn't know I had done that well. And it was funny because it was just a small bone, probably not a huge weight in the grading scale, but it really, I remember that moment kind of ignited that real confidence in me in that history field.
Yeah.
Well, we go another year, and I'm an undeclared like sophomore, almost junior at this point. And finally, Dr. Rice became my advisor, and she's like, I think you should do something with history classes or history because you've taken almost all the history classes you can. You're now getting to the higher level history classes. You're taking all the generals, you do well in them, you seem to enjoy it, whether you realize it or not. And I kind of fell into the, what are you going to do? Teach? I was like, well, sounds good. I didn't have a plan to begin with, so that sounds like, the most logical next step. And so I started doing education classes, and I loved them. And I really attribute that kind of time in my life is to really working on those soft skills, that public speaking, that being comfortable in front of others. And I joke now because I've been fortunate to do podcasts. I've been on ESPN. I've done SEC Network. I've done the news stations and all that. Nothing is scarier than a middle school class of students. They're the most terrifying beings of all time because they're terrified of you. They're terrified of themselves. They're laughing. They're crying, usually all in the same class period. And it really helped build that confidence in me. We advanced a little bit through there. I realized the education in the classroom route probably wasn't in the cards, wasn't my next step. That being said, that was basically July of when I'm graduating. So I had to go back for my summer and take 2 foreign language credits. It was actually Spanish. And I learned a lot, and it was really cool about the immersion aspect because since we needed to get these credits done, there was actually 2 one-month classes where we were together for 4 hours a day for 4 days a week. And actually, I could understand Spanish probably better than I could ever have after doing 101 and 102. However, I'm now like, okay, what am I going to do next? I now have a degree in history. I'm not going to go work at a school. And that moment was like, oh, what am I going to do now? And I remember thinking more and more what I really wanted. I really love this history thing. Maybe is grad school an idea? And so thankfully, I was living in Eau Claire the summer, and I talked to my advisor, Dr. Rice, literally like July, August of that year. I'm like, hey, I'm kind of thinking about maybe grad school. I'm like, what are the next steps? And she kind of laughed. She's like, it's about time. Like, we can't tell you to go to grad school, but like, we could see you in grad school. And that's kind of been the joke in our department. Well, I have to laugh because I'm like, okay, well, if I go home back to Milwaukee, the Milwaukee area, I'm not going to go back to school. I just know that about myself. I know I'm not going to go back to school, and I don't want to go somewhere else. What can we do here? And she said, well, I obviously would vouch for you and make sure we can do all that. But the toughest thing is we're going to have to talk to the chair of the department. Well, of course, the chair literally rolls her chair down, and she's like, he's in. We'll figure out the rest. So they actually ended up waiving my GRE. They waived all my fees to apply. And the toughest thing is the first week of grad school, I had to audit my classes. We were waiting for all the paperwork to go through. So I'm sitting there like technically not a student. I had to go to explain to some of the professors like, hey, I'm here, I'm on paper, we're working on the last little bit. But it was funny because I knew a lot of these professors by like first name. I knew their kids because I had been there 5 years already.
Right.
And so it was like, what was the additional two? And of course, as I mentioned, I had a little bit of that concern of that imposter syndrome. And I quickly, thankfully, that wore off. And I really was able to kind of embrace who I was, enjoy what I had at Eau Claire, but also really get deep into the areas I found interesting, the areas I studied.
It's interesting that you thought you had some imposter syndrome because you literally were so great. You know what I mean? Like they were immediately vouched for you. It's like the opposite. And I would think your ego would be big, like, oh, yeah, but it's interesting how we internalize these things and interpret these things. So you have worked in curation and archives and museums. And I feel like in media, we either see it's like Indiana Jones or we see it's like you said, some old stodgy professor, like who's hidden away, kind of a hermit. Can you pull the curtain back on what that entire world actually is? Maybe a better question is, why is it important? Why is it important to have history preserved and for the public to be able to consume?
That is a great question. One of the things I ended up loving about history is I'll give you my official graduate, what I studied in school. I studied my master's in public history, where I looked at African American history, primarily during the civil rights movement, looking at the backdrop of the Cold War, studying U.S. foreign and domestic policies and how those interacted in the world in general, and then also sports and popular culture.
Okay, I'm going to need to read the thing. That sounds amazing. And I wouldn't necessarily think of putting those two things together, right? Like the American Civil Rights Movement and the effects of the Cold War and impact on it. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. You're good. It's funny you mentioned that because that ended up not even becoming my thesis. I actually ended up so backtrack a little bit. I wrote my undergrad on early American rugby because, as we'll get into it, I've played rugby all throughout this as well.
Yeah.
But I ended up actually gearing more towards that in the sports realm. And so that's why that sports and popular culture kind of actually wrote my master's thesis on college football stadiums in the 1920s.
Ah, interesting.
Looking at the memorial stadiums in Indiana, Illinois, and Minnesota, and kind of how our cynical lens, how we look at universities now that they always want our money. Back then, a lot of students actually really wanted to give back money to their universities. And of course, universities are smart enough to understand that, hey, if we have the student led, it makes it a little bit more palatable when we want a new stadium or a new building. We can call it the Memorial Stadium or the Memorial Garden or whatever we have. It's funny you mentioned that because sports became my real interest in pipeline to the history. As we talked about, I was fortunate to first be an intern in 2016 at the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio. And of all ways that worked is the guy who ended up starting the New England Patriots Hall of Fame and now who was with the Green Bay Packers attended grad school at Eau Claire about 10 years before I did. And our professors, again, apparently they really liked him too. And they saw us on a very similar track and he was able to connect me and help me get the internship.
Cool.
But as far as you ask why it's important, I think so much of the world we see today, while history doesn't repeat itself, the joke is that it often looks very similar or it rhymes. I think so much of that we can learn by looking back at the past, but also understanding who was telling the story in the past. A lot of times, as you mentioned, it might have been a specific type of person sharing those stories. And so one of the things I was fortunate to do, both in my time at the Pro Football, but especially at the College Football Hall of Fame, was tell that new narrative, that new story, whether it was talking about integration in college football, especially in the South, or it was talking about the importance of historically Black colleges and universities. And I have to laugh. One of my first big exhibits I did myself was me straight up pulling papers from grad school. As we mentioned a little bit about what I had studied, the sports popular culture, looking at guys like Kenny Washington and Jackie Robinson and guys like that. I'm literally pulling papers from grad school. I'm looking at them. Okay, well, I'm going to use this part as an exhibit piece. What can we have to complement that in the curation process? And so it's funny because there was a lot of full circle moments at the College Football Hall of Fame where I was able to really use a large amount of what I had learned into sharing those stories for others in the next generation.
Yeah. I love that. And I think it's oftentimes, I think we have this notion, or some people have this notion of like, that doesn't affect me. It's really interesting to me how we oftentimes can separate ourselves from history when we are a product of history, right? And you may not think that beer in Mesopotamia affects us today, but it does. It's like crazy to think about, right? And I think it's cool because you're putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. And to your point, being able to tell the story with all the voices involved, not just the loudest voice or like history is written by the victors, right? Well, there's a lot of other people that were involved as well. So the other thing that I love about history, and I was an English major, so it was one of those things where you're reading a book and they mention a detail and you're like, well, wait, why did they mention that detail? And then the next thing you know, you're learning about like 17th century brick formations on estates in Augustan literature or something, but it does all kind of connect to each other. And I think especially with a liberal arts education, you get to think critically about the world and how it's a constellation of what's the word I'm looking for? Like we are a constellation of events, I guess is the right word. And we're in this society now, and I'm like part of it, right? Like you just scroll. If it's like more than 10 seconds, you scroll, and like news is immediate, and we don't take the time to get the full scope and richness of the story behind it. I feel like your story so far has been so layered like that, and you can kind of see how these different pieces fit together. Can you talk a little bit about working for the College Football Hall of Fame and the Pro Football Hall of Fame? And what was that experience like, especially as someone who used sports and history in your grad school work? Was there a big difference from how you presented it in the collegiate perspective versus the professional perspective?
That's an excellent question, and a bit about the story, because I went from the highest of highs to a pretty good high to the lowest of lows, and then all the way back up. And it's funny you mentioned that I had my internship in 2016, and I was fortunate enough as a kid from Wisconsin. It was Brett Favre's induction. I know he's been less flattering as of late, but as a football player, I enjoyed what he had done on the field. That being said, I went back to grad school. I started applying for jobs, hundreds of jobs, museums all over the country, just looking for an opportunity. I was fortunate through my friend Leah, who was also at grad school with me. I was able to become an intern at the H. Bennett Studio, which is one of the oldest continuing photography studios in the country in the Wisconsin Dells. And of course, I had a little bit of a background in historic photography from a class we took. We did a project on wet plate photography. But in general, I didn't know a ton about it. But it was one of those really amazing things about the career. I learned it didn't have to be exactly what I studied or what I was interested in, because it was history. I got to learn. I got to take pictures with cameras from before the Civil War.
Cool.
And as someone who just loves history, it was incredible. Well, that internship eventually ends. They actually kept me on 3 additional months. The problem was I was living in the foreign exchange dorm behind the Kalahari Water Park, and my job was week to week at that point because we're trying to get funding each week. And then there was a clear end date in October.
Yeah.
End date happens. I still don't really have a museum job yet, so I have to move home. I move home. One of my friends, his dad runs a cleaning company, and so I was a cleaning specialist, manager, or something. Which, long story short, it became I was cleaning bathrooms at schools, working second shift.
Oh, yeah.
It was brutal. I mean, it was cold it was winter in Wisconsin. And then during the day, another friend had another job opportunity. If you go to gas stations and you see those advertisements on the top of the pumps, I was putting those in too. In the freezing cold in Wisconsin, you can't even wear gloves, but you need to slide your fingers in. So I'm like, my fingers are freezing. I then go to work night shift at a school of all places with like 2 degrees in history. And I mean, I remember nights, and frankly, I remember crying on the home bridge as I'm driving home because I'm like, surely this isn't it. Like, I know it's not it, but like, what am I supposed to do next? What am I going to do? Job opportunity opens up in Minnesota at the Carver County Historical Society, and I drove up there in a blizzard. And I know if I get face to face with you, I can sell you on hiring me.
Yeah, yeah.
I felt that confident in that aspect. I drove up. When I get up there, I kind of realized that this was probably definitely an entry level position. I'm probably way overqualified for it. And I remember driving back in near tears on the way back, my 6 hours, because I'm like, I'm gonna get this, and I have to do it. Like, it is my next step.
Yeah.
Naturally, I get it, and I was fortunate to end up living with some of my college rugby teammates that had moved up. And the big joke, because I'm from Wisconsin, they're from Minnesota, that I was never gonna move up to Minnesota. Of course, no more than 8 months later after I graduate, I'm up in Minnesota
Right.
with those guys. And of course, it was a lot of fun. But throughout this time, I'd been applying at the College Football Hall of Fame.
Mhm.
But it was a long process. They had a few other people they had been highly interested in. And actually, I didn't get the job.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, bummer. That's a real big bummer. Well, of course, you can't dwell on that too much. I have a museum job, so thankfully I'm up there working, and we'll get into how the business started on this too. But working a lot, making not a lot of money. Finally, the guy who they offered the job to gives me a call because he went to Eau Claire as well years before I. He was using it to leverage his current museum to pay him more. So he had no intention of leaving. And so I get a call from him and like 3 other people that have kind of been in the web of what's been going on. And they're like, call back the Hall of Fame. Tell them you're still interested.
Yeah.
So I do it. And they're like, okay, we'll consider it. I'm like, okay, whatever. About 2 weeks later, like, hey, we'd like to schedule for your last like out-of-person interview. If this goes well, we're going to fly you down to Atlanta for a final interview. They do that. It goes well. They fly me down. So I just been turned down. It's like a 2-week swing of, again, the highs, lows, mediums, upside downs a little bit. But it was funny. I fly down there and they wanted me to not announce who I was the day before. They wanted me to come check out the museum, give my thoughts and kind of feedback on it.
Okay.
I did. And they knew I was from Wisconsin. So what did they do? They sent me to a brewery. The night before, I had a couple beers and sat out this place. It's called New Realm Brewing in Atlanta. And it was the first time I remember FaceTime a couple of my real close friends. It was the first time I actually envisioned myself. I actually might move to Atlanta.
Yeah.
I don't know anyone in Atlanta, but I might actually get it done. Next, I'm preparing for the interview. You got to have all the right questions, be ready to go, all that good stuff. And I realized that the night before, I'm like, I might actually get this, but I can't like pretend to be, some guy who likes to hide in the back office and be around his books. I got to kind of be who I am. And so I remember they had me in the interview, all that, and they asked kind of who I am, what I'm about. And I think all I blurted out was, I'm Jeremy Swick. I love playing rugby. I love cheering on the Green Bay Packers. I love drinking craft beer. And this is how I think I can help the museum. And then I went into actually how I could help the museum. But I learned later that's kind of what sold them all. They're like, wow, we've had so many lame answers.
Yeah, yeah.
Word. I'm like, whatever. Like, because I think I made a joke because you might see me with a busted nose every once in a while. It's rugby, so things happen, and they definitely saw that throughout the years, from bruised tailbones to I walk in like a boot or something like that. Just kind of, you had a fun weekend, I guess. Did you guys win? But one of the biggest differences at the Pro Football Hall of Fame was it was a little bit, I would say, the more reverence. It was more of the traditional museum, if you will. And of course, they do have some interaction aspects, and since I've been there 10 years ago, it's definitely changed. But one of the things I noticed at the College Football Hall of Fame, it was way more of an interactive experience. I wouldn't say it was that balance between a museum and a bit of an attraction, which, has its positives and negatives. But it was one of those things. The really interesting thing was I was still able to tell those stories, but a lot of times it was fun because it was a little bit more of a digital format. Maybe there was a map of where the schools were, or they had a giant light-up helmet with 776 helmets from NAIA all the way to Division. And so when people would enter, they would enter their info, which I learned, bit of that marketing aspect. People are way more willing to give you their information if they think they're going to get something cool. Yeah. So you fill out all that info, and the next thing your school lights up. So, for example, the University of Wisconsin Eau Claire lit up when I went there.
That's cool.
So it was really cool kind of having that experience where I had worked in some of the traditional museums, like I mentioned, the Pro Football Hall of Fame. I loved the H.H. Bennett Studio because it was a very small museum. So I did everything from archiving to I'd be giving my tour. We do our 30-minute tour, and by the end of it, I'm walking this back, and I'm going behind the cash register, and I'm ringing up them, buying their souvenirs and trinkets. So that's been the really interesting thing about the wide variety of museums. Sometimes your job's much more specialized. Sometimes you do a little bit of everything. And I think it's great in that sense of you can experience so much. And I love with the College Football Hall of Fame, they really let me roll with the marketing team. It was also like, hey, it'd be really cool if we did behind the scenes, because people are like, what do archivists, what do curators do? Oh, well, let's do an unboxing. So I know a player sending me his trophy. Let's pull out this really cool trophy. It's really, really cool jersey. And of course, it helped with their social numbers as well.
That's awesome. And then how did you go from that to now Swick Media?
Yeah, so Swick Media 2018 is technically, I'll say, when I quasi started. I had mentioned I was living in Minnesota. I love the museum space, but I was eligible for food stamps for the full-time job.
Yeah.
Not a great combination, but I'm like, I'm not going to go get a second job. I had thought about it, crossed my mind. I have to laugh. I was up in Minnesota this weekend, and the gas station I literally thought about applying for, because I was living up there with my buddies. I was like, I'm glad I didn't, obviously. But I spent about 50, 60 hours on YouTube and Google trying to find a way to create income. And obviously it wasn't passive per se, but something I could do at my house, and not really knowing a ton. I remember seeing these things about social media graphics, and then this app called Fiverr, where it's freelance, but they don't pay a whole lot because they get a lot of it. Well, eventually I somehow sold someone on buying my terribly made graphics. Like, I have to laugh. I know they still exist somewhere in the ether, but I'm glad I haven't seen them. I didn't know what I was doing. I just remember being so jazzed to, make 25, 30 bucks a month, or like these 30 graphics I made, something like $1 a graphic. It's not a very good deal in my sense, but it taught me that next skill of like, okay, how can I utilize this? And that's when I really started doing a little bit more history related content, which then was something I began to sell the Hall of Fame on, and the fact that, I understand the digital space a bit more now. I know people really love the behind the scenes stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I continued to grow throughout there. And once I got down to Atlanta, it was also kind of keep busy. I've been playing rugby the whole time, but also just in between, I'm like, okay, I keep getting more and more clients. There might be something to this. And then my real good friends with the Hall of Fame a couple years in, they knew it got to the point I'm kind of working out of the back on my business. Like, I'm doing what I need to do, but I'm also make sure like I'm getting more clients. And it got to the point where some of that side business money was rivaling my full time, but it wasn't quite there. The confidence for me wasn't quite there. Then the pandemic hits. We all get furloughed. Thankfully, in the sense that I kind of saw it coming a little sooner, in the sense that they're only keeping me as long as I make financial sense.
Right.
I don't think I had my title wrapped up in who I was, thankfully, because I've had so many different titles even at that point that, okay, we're good. Well, of course, that week, everyone's getting let go or furloughed left and right. I'm the last one standing. And of course, they made me do a live stream at like 4 p.m. I did the live stream, and at 5 comes in, and I answer the question before he even said, I'm getting a furloughed, aren't I?
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah. I was like, all right, sounds good. Let me know when you have your stuff figured out. And he's like, what do you mean? I'm going home. He's like, oh, yeah. I'm like, no, I'm flying back to Milwaukee. I will see you. Let me know. I was like, cool. And like, I literally packed all my stuff out because like, maybe, who knows? Maybe it won't come back. I obviously come back. And I remember at that point, I was like, I wasn't saying I was done, but I was ready to that next step. Wasn't exactly sure what that meant. Also, I spent about a month and a half back in Wisconsin. I loved every second of it. And the wheels turning a little bit more and more. But it was one of those things where I was still making income because I had Swick Media. And it wasn't a ton, but it was enough to kind of, frankly, give me a little hope. I think a lot of times in, that early 2020 stage, that's all we really needed, is some hope. But I get back, I get called, they're like, oh, hey, you can come back. I mean, I'll be back in like 3 weeks, guys. I'm taking my time. I'm not rushing this. Eventually get back, we do well. And I remember still doing this, being more comfortable doing podcasts. And a lot of those were me guests on podcasts, talking about the museum, talking about the history aspect. But I saw some traction and some movement there. And of course, every once in a while, people would Google me and look up Swick Media as well, and to ask a question about that. And I wouldn't maybe direct them towards that, but I would also answer those questions. I go home for a weekend, a bachelor party, have a good time. And I also have to laugh because I joked the Milwaukee Bucks are the reasons why I fully moved back. They had won game 5. We were all watching as friends. Game 6 rolls around. It's a Tuesday night. I'm supposed to be back in Atlanta. I tell the job, hey, I'll be back on Wednesday. The Bucks are in the finals. I'm going to go down. All right, sounds good. The Bucks win Game 6. He goes crazy. I call the job, like, hey, I'll be back Monday. And they're like, what? I'm like, there's a parade. Not missing this. I'll see you Monday. And I joked later because one of my friends, one of my coworkers, I ended up working very closely with him my last year and a half there. But he was laughing because he's like, did this guy just go AWOL and refuse to come back to work because the Bucks won the championship? And of course, there was a meeting about me. I learned later, like, hey, what are we going to do? And the big thing was, well, he's obviously a very good employee and he's not doing this to be spiteful. But also, if we call him, he's back home. We all know how much he loves Wisconsin. Straight up just might not come back. They ended up letting me get away with like not working for a week. And I came back and I'm like, in my parade, I'm like, well, that worked. It was never brought up to me. I mean, it was kind of funny, but it also made me realize I'm ready to be home. I just risked the job basically to be like, yeah, you know what, whatever. I want to be back in Wisconsin. But I also knew with all these experiences that patience needed to come into place. So it wasn't going to be the first, trip out of Dodge. I actually ended up being reached out or saw on LinkedIn actually, the Wisconsin Black Historical Society had a job opening as an archivist. And again, my background in African American history, I'd created a lot of amazing exhibits with my team down in Atlanta.
Mhm.
I had a general interest in Wisconsin history, especially in the African American community. And so I ended up applying for that. I was fortunate enough, I could laugh, in 2022 is when Georgia had won their first national championship in several decades. And the confetti's falling on the field, and I know it's for them, but in my brain, it's like for me, because I'm about to get this job out. I'm leaving within the next few months.
Yeah.
Ended up leaving, but continued with Swick Media, continued that growing. And my business coach and partner always laughs because she was the one encouraging me to jump. Probably years before I actually did.
Yeah.
I get to the archives at the museum, and I'm loving what I'm doing. We're doing some social media stuff, but the business really starts to take off. And it gets to the point where last year, the year before, I'm making almost, if not more, on the side than I am
Wow.
my
Yeah.
job.
Yeah.
But the problem is I love museums. I love what I'm doing. And so that I know that stifled me going all in, which I did last year. June 6th was my last day. So that's how I consider the birth of Swick Media. But it just needed to be the right time, and it needed to be on my time, even though it was probably a couple years delayed. When I finally did it, it was such an incredible experience.
That's awesome. That's really amazing. I want to get into rugby a little bit because you played, first of all, I cannot believe you played rugby after the first story that you told us about your head being cracked as a kid, as a baby. And so how did you find rugby and, like what has it meant to you? And now, and I would like to know a little bit more about what you're doing now with Swick Media and rugby as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny. I always joke, we don't find rugby, rugby finds us in
Yeah.
the weirdest ways possible. And, as a former player, you can understand that. I have to laugh because it was actually, he ended up becoming my high school coach. In rugby in high school, it's for the boys, it's in the spring,
Mhm.
mainly because they won't compete with football in the States.
Yeah.
But the girls' seasons are often in the fall. Well, our coach knew, like, a random old dude talking to us probably isn't going to move the needle. He used the girls' team, was like, hey, go recruit your guy friends to come play rugby with us.
Yeah.
It literally worked.
Yeah, of course.
All 13, 14 of my friends were like, oh, that sounds cool. Like, you
Yeah.
know what this is. And so we remember starting practices in the gym. And I don't know, the second I felt it, I fell in love with it. And I could never let it go. And I don't know if I thought it was going to be that big of an influence in my life, but it became one. I decided, besides the academic aspect of Eau Claire, it was 100% to play rugby as well.
Yeah.
And I'd argue, as I mentioned, with my lack of educational success, it was probably more to play rugby. And a team I knew I could walk on and hopefully play.
Yeah.
I was fortunate in the sense I played 6 of my 7 years there. I somehow weaseled my way to get a hardship waiver for my first year of grad school because there wasn't a club within 100 miles. And somehow they let it, year 7, they're like, no, you're done. I'm like, all right, that's fine. So I ended up playing with a team up in Minnesota. We would just drive up for Thursday night practices and then just join wherever there were games on Saturday.
Yeah.
But I realized pretty early into that process is with the museum aspect, I love museums, but also I knew it might take me moving all over the place. So my 2 requirements was at a museum could I live within a city limit, and was there a rugby team?
Love it.
And to be frank, it was more, was there a rugby team? Do they have a museum? Oh yeah, city limits are nice, you know.
Yeah.
And so, I played briefly when I was down in Akron, Ohio. I played with some of those guys for that summer. I still have a buddy I keep in contact with. From there, I really knew it gave me confidence when I moved to Atlanta that I wanted to play rugby there. I was fortunate. The team I chose was Atlanta White. And before I started working, I was playing rugby. I moved down there, reached out to them. And what we did in Atlanta, which was genius, once you get a spot, they send 3 or 4 guys to help you move in. There's no way after guys help you move into your apartment, you're not going to show up for at least a couple of trainings, but you're at least going to show up for a few.
Yeah.
And of course, that sold me. I mean, those guys still are some of my best friends to this day. I have to laugh because as I move back to Wisconsin, I, of course, am going to continue playing rugby. And so when I move back, I reached out to some of the guys I knew from high school and back in the day. And they told me to, hey, join the Milwaukee Barbarians. And we have something really fun brewing here. And of course, I did that. And now I get to hang out with my teammates there. But it was incredible because as Swick Media continued to grow, I was actually able to, and one of my first real big client was actually USA Club Rugby. And it was running their marketing and social media and website. And one of the biggest questions that they were, because obviously there's a lot of rugby players out there, a lot of people who kind of do social maybe as a side project. Well, they wanted someone who was also involved in not just as a player, but how are you involved in rugby? And one of the other aspects of Swick Media, and my friends joke, is it just a pipeline to feed and fund rugby? I now currently sponsor 9 clubs kind of throughout the country, but I was able to show that it was more than just me playing. It was more than me just doing marketing, social media, but it was me having that love to give back to the game because I remember as a college student, especially that time, we'd go raise funds, and a lot of times we didn't have people who wanted to fund us a whole lot. And I always told myself if I was there in a position to give back, I absolutely would. It was one of those things that it keeps giving back to the point where one of the next steps was I was at a pop-up museum for rugby down in Atlanta. We exchanged contact info. A couple years later, they reached out and actually built the Women's Rugby Foundation's museum website. And I got to nerd out about rugby. I got to nerd out about history, women's sports, and I ended up creating their digital exhibit. And they eventually invited me last year to be an ally scholarship recipient to come to their conference and do more social media content, which both helped them and Swick Media, of course. And so it was really another unlock to realize I can keep combining my passions. Just because I'm not in the museum space anymore doesn't mean I can never be in a museum space ever again.
Right.
Just because I'm not doing sports, I can't be in sports. And so it literally was one of those other things on top of launching the podcast.
Yeah. It's so cool. Never would you have imagined, I can only imagine as a little kid in the library learning about, the pyramids of Giza or whatever, that your life would take this multi-hyphenate place that you're in. And I think what's really cool, Jeremy, about your story is you never tie your identity to one thing. You just know who you are and what you like, and then you kind of let it go from there. Would you say that's accurate?
I would say that's absolutely accurate. Rome wasn't built in a day. I tell people this person was not built in a day. There have been many trials and tribulations, moments of self-doubt, moments of what am I doing? This was a terrible decision. Moments of not having that confidence to either speak up or maybe speak too much. I don't think you ever speak too much. I think that's fine. But I think it's one of those things that I tell people this didn't happen overnight. It was a long, arduous process. But at this point, I feel very comfortable in who I am. And I think so much of it is that authenticity. And of course, am I the same everywhere I go? No. But am I very similar? Yes. And my friends all laugh. We were sitting by the pool last week and we're sitting having the pool, having a good time. And I joke, I had to put my Superman cape up because I was actually up there also covering rugby. I quick change. I literally swimsuit. I think, change that quick. And I'm going, and then I go to the women's professional game and I'm shooting content there, talking to the players and doing all that.
Yeah.
Have a good time and then drive back to my friend's house. And hey, that was a fun 3 hours. We're back to doing our regularly scheduled programming.
I love it. That's really awesome. And just like with history, we don't always know until we look back what the meaning is and how it shapes us. So this has been such a fun conversation. I have to ask, do you have a favorite historical era that like you just can't get enough of, or a subject within history that you're just like, I love this and I could research it forever?
So for me, it's a tough question, but I'll counter it quite a bit. For me, it's one I have as a favorite historical player. His name was Kenny Washington. He reintegrated the NFL in 1948. He was at UCLA. He was teammates with Jackie Robinson and Woody Strode. He sounded like a made-up character in a movie. He worked for LAPD. He was a professional baseball player in the Pacific Coast League. His dad was a movie star and actually did a lot of movies with John Wayne, Blue Washington, and his life is absolutely remarkable. And I learned a lot about him as a grad student, but then especially at the College Football Hall of Fame because he was a member of there. I move on a little farther from the Hall of Fame, and of course, I'm starting able to get some of this memorabilia. And I actually have his letter from 1935, his junior year of high school. And it is one of the proudest things I own. I have his 1940 belt buckle from when he was named to the College All-Americans, the Chicago Tribune All-American team. And through that, I was actually to create a relationship with the Washington family. And they're very appreciative of being a steward of him. People have been offered nice sums of money for these, and there was no intention to ever sell it. My plan is eventually donate to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. I don't know when it'll happen because I really like looking at it, but that'll be the ultimate plan. But he's probably been my favorite interest in history. I have to laugh because some of the museum pieces, the posters and things like that, well, we're getting rid of them. And so I took some of them with me. I have to laugh in my hallway. There's a couple odes to Kenny Washington and among a few other players. But
That's cool. Well, one of my questions was going to be if you could have a historical figure on your podcast, who would it be? Would it be Kenny or would it be someone else?
it would be Kenny Washington.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm working on getting some of the family members. So
That's
Kenny adjacent.
That's so awesome. And then do you have a museum that you recommend to people like this is a must go, or is there a museum that you really want to visit?
I would say everyone, if you're in Washington, D.C., check out the National African American History Museum. It's one of the most powerful museums I've ever been to.
Yeah.
You start on the ground level, underground, if you will, and get to the modern day. I mean, that one for me is probably one of the most powerful. DC just has such amazing museums, that the Holocaust Museum as well. That was another powerful. And I decided to do those twice, both in one day. And it was a powerful day of self-reflection, if you will. And not to laugh, I was down there I was covering rugby. And so I was there covering the men's and women's national teams. And so I had a moment, kind of a full circle moment, that I'm getting paid to go to DC to cover rugby of all things. And of course, as a museum guy, I'm going to hit a museum when I'm in town or around. Between museums and thrift stores, basically anytime I go somewhere, I got to check out what,
You got to travel together. That sounds great. Add a brewery in there and we're like set. We're
perfect. We're perfect. Yeah.
I lived in DC for a long time and I never took for granted the Smithsonian system. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But the African American History Museum is just next level. Like it is just, it's unbelievable. That's very cool. And so we talked about so many things. We could keep talking, but like, is there anything that you want listeners to hear that we haven't covered, or anything else you want to talk about before we ask the 3 questions I ask everyone?
I think the last thing is just a little bit about the podcast, Into the Unknown. And I have to laugh because it's very tied into Swick Media. I had started doing the social media content, and slowly some of my clients started to decide or evolve that they wanted a podcast, and they asked if I could do it. And of course, in my can-do attitude or naivete, that I was like, oh yeah, sure. I spent another 30 hours. Okay, how DaVinci Resolve? What's that? How do you edit a podcast? And I get to the point where I feel comfortable. I do it, and I'm editing several podcasts, and I'm seeing things from the marketing and social aspect of what I think is right. And again, I don't have a marketing degree, as we mentioned. I have 2 degrees in history, but I'm starting to have a kind of a feeling for some of these things. Well, I realized as I wanted to expand Swick Media, my new clients wouldn't be just, hey, trust me, I know what I'm talking about. So I decided to launch Into the Unknown in 2023 with now an exercise that my clients do is we reach out to 30 of our dream guests in our network. And I tell people that doesn't mean, and I was joking, President Obama was the one. It's like, oh, if you don't know President Obama, probably not going to have him on. Right. But one of the other things I realize is a lot of times these people that we admire or like to talk to, we might be in the same house or in the same building as them. We might not be on the same floor yet. And sometimes we might be in the next room. Sometimes we're in the same room and we're not quite in that circle yet, but it's never that far off. And I asked 30 of my dream guests, and I was fortunate through my past experiences. Some of them happened to be former professional players, coaches, Olympians, and things like that. Well, all 30 said yes. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess we got to do that. And so 56 or so episodes later, we're still doing it. It's been really fun to hear stories like yourselves. And there's all those connections that you can never even imagine. For example, you and I in rugby.
Yep.
And it's one of those things that I've really loved the podcast as a way to just learn more and share more with others, but selfishly have some incredible people on.
Yeah.
Get to know a little bit about their story and their insight.
Yeah. Everyone is so interesting. And one of the things that I absolutely love about your podcast is how do we know each other? And everybody has a connection. Like we were complete strangers. We have the rugby connection, which rugby isn't like the most like common sport, but it's also not the most uncommon sport, right? And then I was like, wait, Omar Eaton Martinez, who I went to college with, and it is such a small world. The podcast is awesome. Definitely listen to it. So again, I could talk to you all day. We're going to have to plan a trip together so we can go to a museum and a brewery and all of the above. Actually, it's in Milwaukee, right? Where like there's this cool brewery next to the Museum of Art, like on the lake. That was pretty great. That was pretty awesome. I didn't get to thrift when I was there, but it was pretty awesome. Anyway, okay. So what do you love most about what you're doing now?
I love sharing other people's stories. And I
Yeah.
know today we talked about my story, which I was joking with my friends is usually the tougher thing for me to do. I feel very comfortable in my story. One of the things I've loved about whether it's having guests as podcasts or producing podcasts for others, it's so cool to see their story because I think people's stories matter. And I don't think enough of us realize how important their stories are. I think sometimes just for us individually to get out and just say what's on our mind. I think of one of my favorite podcasts. She's my client, one of my close people. Her podcast is Say More Words with Tamika Taylor. And her idea is saying more words. And I have to laugh anytime she's reaching or we're talking and I'm having a bad day or spiraling or whatever it may be. All she does is say more words. And I spit out, the first couple of things are kind of surface level. And then, by the third thing, I'm actually, hey, this is actually what's bothering me. I'm freaking out about X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
And so I think there's so much opportunity, obviously not to just freak out, but also just to share your story. And that's been my, I think, favorite part about this journey so far.
And what advice would you give to your younger self?
Advice to my younger self. I would say to my younger self to continue to trust the process. It's something I've said for years, and my friends laugh because they know how much I've said it. But it's been really cool throughout the years, last decade, 15, 16 years, whatever it may be. I've had people randomly reach out. Hey, I remember you were all saying trust the process. I had something, I wasn't getting hired as a coach, XYZ. And some reason you stuck in my mind that, Sumo always says trust the process.
Yeah.
And he's like, I kept doing it. And then now I'm a baseball coach at XYZ or this panned out. And for me, it was just like, I think part of it was I didn't have any other choice.
Yeah.
As we've talked about a lot of these moments and the moments of pivot and moments of change, it's like, well, I guess I'm going to just keep doing what I think is the next best thing. It might not be the right thing, the next best thing. So I would tell that person, just keep trusting the process because it's going to work out in ways you can't, like, as we talked about, I can't even comprehend trying to explain this to my younger self of how literally everything you've ever really dreamed about has worked out, but not how you thought it was. In some other capacity, some other way of life. And sometimes all you can do is just laugh about how crazy or how incredible the experience has been.
Yeah. And I want to give you some credit as well, because it's trusting the process, but it's also appreciating it when you're in the moment. And I'm not sure everybody does that. So I love that you're able to stop and recognize like, wow, I'm living my dream. And maybe it wasn't what I thought it was going to look like, but I'm living it and I'm here. And oftentimes, I don't know if you feel this way. Oftentimes it's better than what I thought it was going to look like. The way that it turned out, I was like, yeah, if I had done the other thing, it just wouldn't be as rich of an experience. So I give you a lot of credit for being able to see it. And Jeremy, where can people find you?
And so I'm pretty much everywhere, but .com if you're interested in working together on podcasting or anything like that.
And that's SWICK.
Yes, SWICKMEDIA.com, Swick Media. But on social media, you can look up The Average Historian. That is where I'm on Instagram, TikTok, all that good stuff. Otherwise, if you just Google Jeremy Swick, I usually am the first like 2 or 3 pages. So I always apologize to other Jeremy Swicks out there because, yes, it is my intention to keep your SEO much lower than mine. And so I have to laugh because I know there's one guy who played lacrosse and one guy who's a musical artist. And I'm like, you might need a name change. My goal is always to be accessible wherever you can find me. I love talking history, sports, podcasting. Even if you just want to riff or you want to be a guest on the podcast, I always like to have that open door policy.
And plus, Jeremy Swick is a cool name. It like sounds like a movie star name.
Right?
Well, this has been such a fun conversation. I didn't even get to like half my questions. Like I could just talk to you all day. The podcast is Into the Unknown. You can learn more about Jeremy and the guests that he's had on. You can find him in all the places he said, and that'll be in the show notes as well. Jeremy, thank you so much for being here today.
Megan, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoy our conversation, and I look forward to continue to see your journey unfold.
Awesome. Thanks.